The vineyard was perfect. The guests were glowing, the music flawless, and then I arrived. I wasn't late. I wasn't uninvited. But when I stepped onto the cobblestone path, my mother blocked the doorway, looked me in the eyes, and said, "You're not welcome here. Not because of who I am, but because of what I knew." This wasn't just a wedding. It was a cover-up funded by the money they stole from me. This time I didn't bring flowers. I brought evidence. Seattle's sky was often cloaked in gray, as though the clouds preferred to linger, softening the edges of the skyline. Daniel Reeves never minded. He had grown to like the way the light filtered through overcast mornings. Quiet, consistent, unassuming, much like himself. At 35, Daniel lived a life that many might consider modest. He ran a boutique digital marketing consultancy, crafting campaigns for ethical brands and local businesses that couldn't afford the flash of big ad firms. His days were spent editing brand stories, designing content strategies, and mentoring younger creatives who were more lost than they appeared online. His office was a cozy, plant-filled corner suite in a shared creative space, and his evenings often ended with jazz records and herbal tea. He wasn't broke, he wasn't lost, but to his family he might as well have been invisible. Daniel came from the kind of family where legacy meant more than love. The Reeves name carried weight in certain East Coast social circles, the kind passed down with country club memberships and trust fund expectations. His parents, Ronald and Cynthia, had worked hard to maintain the veneer of class, even if the wealth behind it had become more diluted over the years. Still, the values remained intact: image, ambition, control. And then there was Brandon. Daniel's older brother, Brandon Reeves, was the embodiment of those values. At 38, Brandon had already graced the top 40 under 40 lists in regional business magazines, launched a luxury real estate firm that catered to the ultra-rich, and was a fixture at fundraisers and real estate summits. His Instagram was curated like a brand campaign: tailored suits, champagne toasts, candid moments staged with perfect lighting. Their parents adored him, not just for his success, but for how that success reflected back onto them. Brandon wasn't just a son, he was proof that their blueprint worked. At family dinners, Brandon's voice filled the room. He always had a new story: a client buying a vineyard in Napa, a bidding war on a penthouse in Vancouver, an influencer engagement at his latest condo project. He had the kind of charisma that didn't ask for attention, it demanded it. Daniel often found himself fading into the background, playing the role of quiet observer in a room full of performances. It wasn't as though Daniel had failed to impress them. He simply never tried to perform. His success was quieter, measured not in headlines or accolades, but in the loyalty of clients who sent handwritten thank you notes, in the way a small bakery doubled its revenue after his rebrand, in the steady satisfaction of work that aligned with his values. But those weren't things you could brag about at brunch. And in his family, if you couldn't be bragged about, you were barely remembered. Daniel had learned over time not to expect much. When he graduated top of his class from university, Brandon's new office launch overshadowed it. When he landed his first six-figure client, his parents asked if he'd consider getting a real job again. He laughed it off, but inside it stung. Every time. Still, he kept showing up. Birthdays, holidays, the occasional family vacation. He wasn't trying to win approval anymore, not really. But something in him still hoped quietly for recognition. For someone to say, "You matter too." It was a fragile kind of hope, but it kept him grounded in the discomfort of belonging to a family that never quite saw him clearly. He wasn't jealous of Brandon. That would have been too easy. No, what Daniel felt was more complex, a kind of distant grief, like mourning a version of his life that had never existed. He didn't want Brandon's spotlight, he just wanted space for his own light. There was a moment not long ago when a former client, a retired English teacher, had hugged him and said, "You make people feel seen, Daniel. That's your magic." And Daniel had smiled not because of the compliment, but because he knew it was true. That magic, however, had never worked on his family. The invitation arrived in Daniel's inbox on a Tuesday morning. The subject line was "Simple Family Dinner, Let's Reconnect." The message sent from his mother's email was short and warm in that curated way she often used when trying to summon civility. Daniel hesitated, rereading it 3 times. They hadn't asked him to join any family dinners in months. His gut told him there was a reason for the sudden gesture. Still, he said yes. Hope had a stubborn way of convincing him to keep showing up. The dinner was held at his parents' house, a sprawling colonial with trimmed hedges and an entryway that smelled faintly of lavender and lemon polish. He arrived on time as always. Brandon naturally was late. When he did show up, it was with his fiancée Madison on his arm, both dressed like they had walked out of a photo shoot. The evening began with small talk. Wine was poured. Appetizers were served on porcelain dishes inherited from Daniel's grandmother. There were the usual compliments on Madison's dress. Brandon's recent podcast feature, his upcoming feature in Modern Estates. Daniel nodded along, offering quiet congratulations, nursing his drink like a shield. Then came the pivot. So Brandon began clinking his glass lightly for attention. "We've set a date for the wedding." "Oh," Daniel raised his eyebrows. "That's great. It's going to be in Napa." Madison chimed in, her tone breezy. "Private vineyard, very intimate. We're working with a luxury planner who only takes on 3 weddings a year." Daniel smiled politely. "Sounds beautiful." Brandon leaned forward, elbows on the table. "We want it to be unforgettable. Classy, exclusive, but warm." You know, Ron and Cynthia both nodded approvingly, their faces glowing with approval. "There's just one thing," Cynthia added, setting down her wine glass. "Brandon and Madison are curating the guest list very carefully. It's limited. Extremely limited." Daniel looked between them, unsure where this was going. "We were hoping," Brandon continued, "that those closest to us could help bring the event to life. Like really be a part of it. Spiritually, emotionally, and practically." There it was, the pitch wrapped in sentiment. Daniel blinked. "You're asking for money," Madison gave a soft laugh. "Not money. Just support. A gesture. Everyone in the family's contributing. Even Aunt Lucy's helping with the welcome dinner." Cynthia stepped in smoothly. "Of course, we know everyone has different capacities, but being part of something so meaningful, well, it just wouldn't feel complete without full buy-in." From the heart, Daniel felt the walls inching inward. The words were polite, even gentle, but the message was clear: if you want to be included, you'd better contribute. He took a breath. "I appreciate the invite. Really. But if you're asking for my honest input, maybe a smaller, simpler wedding would mean more. Something personal. Less about scale, more about substance." There was a beat of silence. Brandon's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened just slightly. "We've already locked everything in," he said. "The planner, the venue, the theme. It's a bit late for philosophical shifts." Cynthia gave a tight smile. "Daniel, dear, you've always valued meaning over extravagance, and that's lovely. But this is different. This is family legacy." That word again, legacy. By the time dessert arrived, a delicate lemon tart with bruleed edges, the tone had settled into something cooler, polite but restrained. Daniel answered questions when asked, but said little else. He watched as his parents and Brandon exchanged plans and inside jokes, discussing wine pairings and guest favors like a team rehearsing a play. When he stood to leave, Madison was in the kitchen with Cynthia, and Brandon walked him to the door. Just before Daniel stepped outside, his mother caught up to him, her hand light on his arm. "Darling," she said, her voice low, if you're not feeling inclined to be part of the preparations or if you feel the expense is too much. Don't feel obligated to attend, Daniel blinked. You're uninviting me. Oh no, of course not, she said quickly. It's just, space is limited, and we'd hate for you to feel uncomfortable knowing others have invested so much. It's only fair to those who've stepped forward. He looked at her for a long moment, the words sinking in like cold rain. She was smiling softly as if she were doing him a kindness. I see, he said finally. She kissed his cheek, the kind of kiss you give a distant acquaintance. Drive safe. Daniel stepped into the night, the air sharp with coastal wind. He stood there for a moment on the porch, his breath misting in the dark, wondering how a dinner that promised reconnection had left him feeling more severed than ever. The email came on a Thursday afternoon. The subject line read, "Wedding Update." Daniel opened it without hesitation, already expecting something detached, maybe logistical. What he didn't expect was the tone, grateful, courteous, and chillingly final. Daniel, thank you again for your thoughtful suggestions the other night. Madison and I have given things a lot of thought, and we truly respect your perspective. That said, we've finalized the guest list. It's tighter than we anticipated, and space at the venue is extremely limited. We hope you understand and will celebrate with us in spirit. Wishing you all the best, Brandon. Daniel read it twice, then a third time. His chest tightened not from shock but from confirmation. There it was, the soft, polished cruelty of exclusion masked as practicality. His brother had uninvited him, formally, politely, and with plausible deniability. He closed the laptop gently, as if too much force might rupture the fragile illusion that he still mattered to them. It wasn't the absence from the wedding that stung the most. It was the realization that his presence had never been considered essential in the first place. For a moment, Daniel sat still, the silence in his apartment louder than any worse. Then something flickered inside him, not rage, not even hurt, but a sudden clarity. He thought of the family trust, the revocable living trust established a decade ago under the guise of building a legacy together. Daniel had contributed more than anyone at the start, pouring in his savings. His early freelance windfalls, the modest inheritance from his grandmother. His parents had insisted it would benefit everyone, that it would be used for joint investments, family security, shared goals. But he hadn't seen a statement in years. He logged into the online portal tied to the trust. The password took him a few trees. The interface was clunky, outdated. When he finally got in, the screen populated with rows of transactions, some familiar, most not. His jaw clenched. The trust, once holding just over $1.2 million, with nearly 40% of that from Daniel, was down to under $80,000. The rest had been drawn out in a series of authorized disbursements, many marked vaguely consulting fees. Wedding planning. Temporary liquidity transfer. The names on the approval lines were his parents. The recipient accounts, almost all linked to entities under Brandon's name. Reeves Development, Vineline Concepts, BR, Legacy Projects. Daniel clicked through, heart pounding. None of these had been disclosed. He hadn't been notified, hadn't signed a thing, hadn't even been copied on decisions. It wasn't theft, not technically. He was only a beneficiary, not a trustee. Legally, the power resided with his parents. But morally, ethically, it was exploitation masked as structure. They had used his money to fund Brandon's ambitions, then had the gall to frame it as family advancement. He leaned back in his chair, the room spinning slightly. So this was the truth. They hadn't just excluded him from the wedding. They had erased him from their future plans long ago. They had taken from him his resources, his trust, his place, and handed it over, all in the name of legacy. For the first time in a long while, Daniel allowed the anger to rise. Not the kind that erupts in shouting, but the slow-burning kind, the kind that calcifies resolve. He grabbed a notebook and started listing dates, amounts, names of entities. He logged every transaction. He screen-captured statements. He opened an encrypted folder on his drive and began to document. He wasn't planning revenge, that wasn't his style. But he was done pretending. He called his old friend Marissa, a financial advisor who had helped him with a campaign years ago. She agreed to meet the next morning. After hanging up, he stood at the window and looked out over Seattle's dusky skyline. The city lights blinked to life, indifferent, eternal. The wedding was no longer the story. The story was the slow, silent theft of belonging and the man who finally decided not to let it slide. The next morning, Daniel sat in a sunlit office downtown across from Marissa Chen, a former colleague turned trust litigation attorney. She had the kind of mind that turned legalese into strategy and a sharpness that never dulled with time. "So let me get this straight," she said, flipping through the documents Daniel had brought. "You're a named beneficiary of the Reeves Family Trust, but you're not a co-trustee. Your parents manage the assets and they've used them substantially for Brandon's business and now his wedding." Daniel nodded. "Without my knowledge, without any formal disclosures, just drained it one transaction at a time." Marissa leaned back. "Unfortunately, that's legal under most revocable trusts unless the terms say otherwise. Trustees have wide latitude." But she tapped the folder. "If we can prove mismanagement, self-dealing, or breach of fiduciary duty, especially involving non-trust-related expenditures, you have a case, especially if their actions favored one beneficiary over another." Which they clearly did. Clearly she agreed, but it's going to take more than a bank statement. You need patterns, intent, communications, internal inconsistencies. We need to show they didn't just forget to loop you in, they chose to exclude you. Daniel nodded, a slow exhale leaving him. He wasn't surprised, just sobered. "I'm not here to ruin them. I just want to expose the truth." Marissa smiled faintly. "That's usually more powerful than revenge." That night, Daniel began his silent operation. He didn't post online. He didn't confront anyone. He didn't even return Brandon's email. Instead, he turned his small apartment into an evidence lab. He bought a dedicated recorder, installed call logging apps, and started requesting full records from the trust's investment firm statements dating back 10 years. He emailed banks requesting wire transfer records under beneficiary rights. He went through old emails, scanned receipts, and highlighted conversations that seemed innocuous at the time but now read like warning signs. He called his accountant and asked for help reconstructing his contributions to the trust. Every dollar, every date, every intended purpose. The numbers were stark. Daniel had put in more than $480,000 over the years, directly or indirectly. He hadn't seen a cent returned. Late at night, he'd sit by his window with headphones on, reviewing audio from old voice memos, family dinners, voicemails. He pieced together quotes like a detective building a motive, his father saying, "It's all family money anyway." His mother mentioning Brandon's vision is the future of this family. It wasn't illegal, but it was personal. Each document, each recording added weight to his case, not just in court, but in his spirit. This wasn't about retribution anymore. It was about reclaiming space financially, emotionally, spiritually. He realized something else too. No one was coming to save him. No uncle would step in, no cousin would whisper dissent at a family barbecue. The Reeves family, like many polished families of means, operated under the unspoken rule of appearances. Speaking out would make him the disruptive one, the emotional one, the problem, and he was fine with that. Daniel stopped waiting for understanding. He stopped hoping someone would say, "We didn't know." Of course they knew. They just didn't think he'd do anything about it. That's what made the silence so powerful. It wasn't passive. It was tactical. Every quiet move Daniel made was rooted in calm and calculation, in the quiet fury of someone who had finally stopped hoping for justice to arrive and decided to deliver it himself. And in that silence he felt something unexpected: control, real grounded control, not over others but over his own narrative. For the first time, Daniel wasn't reacting. He was planning. When Brandon called 2 weeks later, likely to mend fences or manage optics, Daniel didn't pick up. He let it go to voicemail. He recorded it. He archived it. When Cynthia emailed with a cheerful subject line, "Hope to see you at the shower," Daniel didn't respond. The silence wasn't about withdrawal. It was about declaration. Because silence, when deliberate, is louder than any scream. Daniel hadn't thought about high school in years, but that night, staring at the flood of documents and voice memos on his desk, a memory surfaced, sharp and sudden like the cold. He was 17, senior year. His grades were spotless. He'd been selected to write the commencement speech, a rare honor at St. George's Preparatory Academy, where legacy students were often favored over merit. Daniel had worked for weeks on the draft, writing late at night after track practice, shaping his words with the quiet conviction of someone who still believed they might be heard. The day before the ceremony, his mother called him into the living room. Brandon was home from college, visiting with an expensive haircut and a fresh summer internship lined up at a real estate firm. "We've been talking," she said gently, "and we thought it might be nice if Brandon read your speech." Daniel stared at her. "Why?" "He delivers better," his father added. "More charisma. And the press will be there. You write so beautifully, but Brandon, he can command a room." He remembered how his chest ached, not from anger, but from that strange, weightless grief. He had said yes, of course. What else was he supposed to do? The next day, Brandon stood at the podium and read Daniel's words, his voice smooth and confident, pausing for effect where Daniel had meant sincerity. No one ever knew. No one even asked. It was the first time Daniel felt himself disappear. He'd been disappearing in increments ever since, replaced by the louder voice, the shinier resume, the person who could command a room. The memories came faster now. His college acceptance letter met with silence, because Brandon had closed a major funding round that same day. The time he was nominated for a local marketing award. But his parents missed the ceremony to attend Brandon's client gala. The Thanksgiving where he brought a date, only to have her ignored by everyone because Madison had just launched her lifestyle blog. It wasn't the events themselves, it was the pattern, the slow, deliberate erasure, not by malice but by indifference, the kind of indifference that tells you over time that your presence is optional, your achievements accidents, your voice replaceable. He didn't remember the exact day the depression began, but he remembered the night he nearly acted on it. It was just after college. He'd been rejected from a graduate program he had quietly pinned his hopes on. That same week, Brandon was featured in a real estate magazine, hailed as a visionary under 25. Their parents threw a dinner in his honor. Daniel didn't go. That night he sat in his car under the Queen Anne Bridge, staring at the black water below. The engine was running. His phone battery was dead. And in his mind, everything was quiet, dangerously quiet. He would have done it maybe if not for Mr. Shaw. He hadn't spoken to his old high school teacher in years. But that evening, Shaw had randomly emailed him a link to an article about social storytelling and digital ethics. "Saw this and thought of you." Nothing more. That email saved him. Not because of its content, but because of its timing. Because it reminded him that someone somewhere had seen him. Really seen him. He never told Mr. Shaw what that meant. But from that day on, Daniel kept that email in a folder labeled proof. Not proof of his ability, proof of his existence. Now, years later, the weight of that invisibility returned. But it felt different. He wasn't a boy under a bridge anymore. He wasn't seeking proof, he was becoming it. He wasn't disappearing this time. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about Brandon or the wedding or even the money. It was about the slow, quiet reclamation of self, of space, of identity, because people like him, the quiet ones, the steady ones, the invisible ones, weren't weak. They were just uncelebrated. And Daniel was done waiting for someone else to celebrate him. It started with a name, one Daniel hadn't thought of in years. During a late-night search through archived emails and old project receipts, he stumbled across a 2018 invoice from Garrison Accounting. His eyes froze on the name at the bottom, Monica L. Vega, CPA. She had been Brandon's company accountant for nearly 4 years, quiet, meticulous, and as Daniel recalled, often absent from the splashy events his brother hosted. Brandon once joked she was too honest to be fun. Daniel tracked her down through LinkedIn. Her profile had changed. She was now working freelance, specializing in forensic bookkeeping and corporate audits. Her tagline, "Every dollar has a trail." He sent her a message, "Ms. Vega, I believe we may share concerns about a former employer. I'd appreciate 10 minutes of your time." She replied within the hour. They met the following afternoon at a quiet cafe near Tacoma. Monica arrived precisely on time, no makeup, leather folder in hand. She skipped the pleasantries. "You're Brandon's brother," she said, sitting down. Daniel nodded. "I wondered how long it would take." He blinked. "Excuse me." She opened the folder. Inside were 3 copies of what looked like contract spreadsheets and annotated invoices. "He fired me 2 years ago," she said. "Technically, I resigned. But the truth is, he asked me to falsify entries in a ledger related to outside consulting fees. I refused." She slid a document across the table. It was a scanned invoice titled Venue Investment Consulting, Wine and Vine Estates, a $275,000 expense paid directly from the Reeves Family Trust to a holding company Brandon controlled. The invoice included vague language, event property analysis, generational asset review, strategic engagement. Daniel stared at it. "This isn't a business expense." "Exactly. It was for his wedding venue. He laundered personal wedding costs through fake shell companies and reimbursed himself using trust money, quietly, steadily, and for over a year." Monica handed him a second document, a payment record showing dozens of similar transactions, floral design firms, lighting rentals, even a photography retainer for someone based in Capri, Italy. "All booked under corporate image events," she said. "None of it disclosed to the trust beneficiaries." Daniel leaned back, trying to steady his breath. "Do you have proof this money came directly from the family trust?" She pulled out a USB stick and set it on the table. "I backed up everything before I left. Not out of spite, out of self-preservation. I didn't trust what would happen if someone accused me of wrongdoing." He stared at the stick. "There are emails, contracts, bank traces, and one conversation recorded legally with his consent. He knew I was documenting things for tax audits." "It's all there." Daniel looked up. "Why are you giving this to me now?" Monica's expression softened slightly. "Because I always hoped someone in that family had a conscience. Looks like it's you." 3 days later, Daniel sat with Marissa in her law office, the USB drive connected to her encrypted laptop. "This," she said, "is a bombshell. It's not enough to destroy him, is it?" Daniel asked. "No," she replied, "but it's enough to start a war and win the first battle." They filed a civil suit in the Washington State Superior Court, Reeves et al. Allegations included breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of trust assets, and unlawful self-enrichment. Daniel didn't tell anyone. Not yet. But the papers were served quietly, formally, and with the weight of evidence behind them. It was no longer just a feeling, no longer a suspicion. It was a matter of record, and Daniel the Quiet One had finally spoken. 2 days before the wedding, Daniel drafted an email addressed to every relative close and distant who had ever called themselves Reeves. He kept it brief, no dramatics, no justifications. To my extended family, I won't be attending Brandon's wedding this weekend. This isn't a protest, it's simply a choice. I also won't disrupt the celebration. I wish no embarrassment upon anyone, but I believe in accountability. And so 7 days from now, the Superior Court of Washington will begin doing what I never could be heard. Daniel Reeves. He hit send and turned off his phone. The wedding day arrived like a magazine cover brought to life. The Napa Valley vineyard sparkled under a cloudless sky, manicured down to the last petal. Guests wore linen suits and silk gowns. A string quartet hummed as they took their seats. No one expected Daniel to appear, least of all Brandon, and yet 15 minutes before the ceremony, Daniel walked up the stone path leading to the vineyard chapel. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a tailored blazer, dark jeans, and a calm expression. In his hand, a sealed manila envelope. Guests whispered. A few recognized him from years past. Others asked, "Who's that?" quietly. Brandon spotted him from the altar steps. His smile faltered just briefly, then returned curated. Daniel walked up without rushing. He waited until the photographer lowered her lens, until the wedding planner gave a final nod to the musicians. Then, in front of Brandon, with dozens of eyes watching, he extended the envelope. "Congratulations," Daniel said softly. "Also, this is for you." Brandon took it confused. As he opened it, Daniel leaned in. "It's a summons. Civil court, 7 days. I suggest you read it before dessert." For a moment, time stilled. Then, as Brandon stared at the legal notice, his name, the court seal, the claims in black and white, someone from the crowd raised a phone. It wasn't intentional, just instinct. They were already recording. The moment wasn't loud, no shouting, no scandal, just Brandon frozen mid-aisle holding his brother's lawsuit like a wedding favor. Daniel turned and walked away, leaving behind stunned slunts, and a viral moment in the making. The video hit social media within hours. The caption read, "When your brother brings a lawsuit to your luxury wedding." By morning it had 40,000 likes, then 200,000, then headlines. "Wedding drama or justice served, family feud." Hits legal boiling point at one vineyard ceremony, the quiet brother who finally spoke up. Within 48 hours, the digital world had divided. Some praised Daniel as a hero, others questioned his timing. But the truth was, the court documents were real, the claims were public, the money trail was undeniable. Brandon's picture-perfect ceremony became a punchline. Madison's influencer brand suffered overnight losses. Sponsors dropped. Followers asked questions. Cynthia and Ronald canceled their vacation to Europe. The Reeves family legacy, so carefully constructed over decades, had fractured with a single envelope. And Daniel. He didn't post a thing. He didn't give interviews. He didn't respond to press inquiries. He stayed in Seattle preparing for court. Because this wasn't about likes. This was about finally being seen on his own terms. The courtroom was modest wood-paneled walls, a digital docket board, the low hum of whispers and tension. The Reeves name had never been mentioned in such a setting before. Certainly not like this. Daniel sat calmly at the plaintiff's table beside Marissa, who shuffled documents with surgical precision. Across from them, Brandon looked like a deflated version of his public persona. His once effortless charm buried beneath pressed lips and a 1,000-yard stare. Their parents sat 2 rows behind, pale and silent. The judge called the room to order. "This is a hearing regarding civil complaint number 57291R, Daniel Reeves versus Brandon Reeves et al." Over the next 2 hours, the courtroom became a gallery of evidence. Marissa was relentless but never cruel. With quiet clarity, she presented the original trust agreement Daniel had signed 10 years ago. Financial records tracing over $700,000 funneled through Brandon's shell companies. Testimony from Monica Vega delivered under oath supported by contracts, email chains, and voice memos. And screenshots of disbursements marked as investment advisory, which were actually wedding expenses. She ended with a line that echoed in the room. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a sustained campaign of deception enabled by the people Daniel trusted most. What he seeks now is not punishment, but restoration. Brandon's lawyer argued for a settlement, painting Brandon as misguided but not malicious. They claimed family trust issues should stay within the family. But the judge was unmoved. She leaned forward, glasses perched low on her nose, and addressed the court. The misuse of trust funds, particularly when one beneficiary is systematically excluded, is not a private squabble. It's a legal violation. Then came the ruling. Brandon was ordered to repay the entire amount siphoned from the trust plus court costs and attorney fees. The court also issued a temporary freeze on assets belonging to Reeves Development pending further audit. Daniel's parents, though not charged directly, were named in a recommendation for financial oversight by a third-party trustee. Their social standing, carefully cultivated over decades, fractured instantly. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Daniel didn't stop for interviews. He didn't raise his voice or wave any documents. He simply nodded once to Marissa, to himself, and walked away. Not victorious, liberated. For the first time in his life, Daniel Reeves had not been spoken over, redirected, or erased. He had been heard. The Oregon coast was nothing like Seattle. It was slower, quieter, gentler. Daniel moved into a small craftsman-style home nestled between pine trees and a cliffside view of the Pacific. The scent of salt and driftwood carried through the open windows every morning. There were no skyscrapers here, no legacy to uphold. No surname whispered behind closed doors, just wind waves and a space to rebuild. He opened a small marketing agency in town, calling it Signal North. It wasn't flashy, no glass walls or VC funding, no brand decks with fabricated slogans. He helped local bakeries modernize their websites, created social campaigns for nonprofits, and taught restaurant owners how to tell stories that felt human, not manufactured. He was happy, not euphoric, not manic, with purpose, just steady, anchored. Every now and then letters arrived. Not from his parents, not from Brandon. They came from strangers. People who had watched the court video, read the article from The Atlantic, or found the viral post that still floated on Reddit's front page. One letter, handwritten on lined paper, read, "I've never seen someone like me win. I didn't know we could. Caleb T., New Mexico." Another came from a woman in Vermont. "My sister took everything from our parents' trust. I never said a word, but watching you stand up, it made me rethink everything. Thank you. Miranda J." Daniel kept them in a wooden box on his desk, not as trophies but as mirrors. Proof that his voice had echoed somewhere, that the ripples mattered. He no longer saw himself as someone who had been wronged. He was instead a quiet proof that you didn't need to scream to be heard. You didn't need applause to matter. You only needed the courage to stay standing when silence would have been easier. In town, he became known simply as Dan. Just Dan, who helped the seafood shop triple its business with a single video. Dan, who bought his coffee at the same corner shop every morning and left the tip jar full. Dan, who sometimes stood at the edge of the cliff near his house at dusk, not searching for anything but watching the sky shift finally with nothing to prove. And he smiled more, not because life was perfect, but because for the first time it was real. Daniel sat at his desk, the window open to the salt air, the wood box of letters beside him. In front of him, a blank sheet of paper and a fountain pen he hadn't used in years. He didn't plan to send it, but he needed to write it. Dear Brandon, I'm not writing this for you. I'm writing this for the boy I used to be, the one who always waited for you to look back to acknowledge he was walking beside you all along. There's no hatred in this letter, just clarity. You didn't steal my money. You stole the years I spent believing I had to earn worth from people who measured value by inheritance, not intention. You stole the silence I wrapped around myself so tightly I nearly forgot what my own voice sounded like. And for a long time I thought that was my fault. I thought maybe I wasn't loud enough, sharp enough, useful enough. But I know better now. The court ruling didn't free me. I did. The moment I stopped waiting for recognition. The moment I stopped hoping you'd explain why or apologize for what. The moment I realized that closure wasn't something anyone gave, it's something we claim when we're done handing out chances that only wound. You see, the truth is, I forgive you, but I also release you. You don't get to live in my head anymore. You don't get to haunt every decision, every second guess, every breath I held in to make room for your shadow. You are no longer my benchmark, not for success, not for worth, not for anything. I am done chasing proximity to people who confuse visibility with value. I don't hate you, Brandon. I just no longer need you to see me for me to be real. Goodbye, Daniel. He folded the letter gently, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it in the back of the wooden box, not for revenge, not for keeping score, just to mark the ending. Later that evening, Daniel walked to the cliffs. The sky was a slow burn of gold and rose. He sat on a weathered bench, the sea whispering below the breeze, lifting the edges of his shirt like a silent absolution. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't wonder what came next. He just breathed. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt weightless. Not because he had nothing left to carry, but because he had finally set it down. The sun dipped lower, casting a long amber glow across the waves. And Daniel smiled, not because he'd won, but because he finally knew he had always been enough.